Dzisiaj rozpoczynamy cykl spotkań, które wiążą się z wystawą Atlas Nowoczesności, który zatytułowaliśmy Topografię nieznanego, które będą do pewnego stopnia mapować czy próbować przybliżyć sposoby konstruowania historii w okresie modernizmu, przede wszystkim przez wystawy. Dokładnie o tym jest wykład Diedricha Diederichsena, który wcześniej zatytułowany był Kiedy wierzyliśmy w magię, natomiast teraz zatytułowany jest Być uleczonym przez historię. Tytuł nieznacznie się zmienił. Będzie się odnosił do bardzo szczególnego okresu, który być może właśnie się kończy w historii wystaw, kiedy to gdzieś od lat 70. konstruowano projekty, które miały podsumowywać pewien nurt w sztuce, czy na bieżąco tak naprawdę pisać historię w czasie rzeczywistym. Diedrich Diederichsen jest bardzo aktywnym krytykiem sztuki, ale również kuratorem zajmującym się nie tylko sztuką, ale również kulturą popularną. Jego jednym z ostatnich projektów była wystawa w Haus der Kulturen der Welt, którą zrealizował razem z Anselmem Franke pod tytułem Whole Earth, czyli Cała Ziemia, która dotyczyła narodzin ideologii kalifornijskiej z ducha hipizmu, generalnie rzecz biorąc. Życzę Państwu miłego odbioru. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. I didn't understand it, but I like the way the Polish language produces the different morphology of my name. I think it's the second case, right? Is it the genitive? Yeah, okay. That's nice to hear. What I'm going to do tonight is I'm thinking about a problem that artists and curators have when they want to become relevant. When they have to somehow manage that something becomes relevant at the moment, right now. So that how do we recognize relevance, importance, even historical importance in the moment? Well, that's a general problem of curating and being an artist in your own contemporaneity. And in the Academy in Vienna, where I'm teaching, I have a professorship for theory of contemporary art. And that's very strange because it is distinguished in the Academy from art history, of course, but also there is also a professorship for art history of modern art and postmodern art. So my contemporary art position is even different from that. It is obviously it is even the use in the one for modernism and postmodernism. They do not use the German word for postmodernism. They use another word. They say Nachmoderne, which is like everything that happened after modernism or something like that. So basically, my colleague, she's already covering all that. So what I'm supposed to do is something else. I have to be in charge of the contemporary moment, wherever it happens. No? The problem of the contemporary, even the contemporary in the past or the contemporary in the future, and not necessarily only what's going on right now, because that also overlaps with her terrain. So this is a problem that it's kind of an art philosophical problem, and I'm going to look at this in relation to the group show, the category of the group show, or also the theme-based group show, as an instrument to produce relevance in contemporaneity. And I will do that on a general level, but also looking back at a moment just before the contemporary curator, that we all know, the well-known kind of curator superstar existed. Just briefly before, when there was already some curating, some very specific curating going on, but you didn't have the career idea of being a curator. That is like the 80s, I think. So my paper is called To Be Curated into History, subtitle, Politics of Labor, Power and Charisma in Modern and Contemporary Curating. The appearance of a group of artists, at least in the history of the last 150 years, signifies historical relevance. Whenever something singular emerges or appears out of nowhere, we have a mythological or a religious datum. We have a Messias, or we have something like that. Whenever more than one new object of one kind appears, we have a historical datum. Maybe a fashion, but let's leave that out. So, history is when things happen in large numbers. New things in large numbers. Or at least in some numbers. If history does not appear out of nowhere, or happen by itself, one can help, one can force it. Group shows, long before there were professionally working galleries with their acts of promotion, group shows were a measure to claim historic relevance. They were like magic. They created the historical fact as if one could influence the course of time by sheer willpower. But in order to conjure magical acts, you need a shaman, a shaman. That is why recently the curator had been invented. The curator of a new type, of course, responsible for group shows, theme shows, and other non-monographic representation of artistic practice. I will talk about this often debated phenomenon in this talk several times, but my main point here is to spell out the group show and related phenomena as an exhibition act, in analogy to the speech act. The attempt to make something real by speaking it into existence, if you want to put it like that. You know, the speech act famously is are sentences like, I declare you husband and wife. No? An act like this done by an exhibition, that is my subject matter. This in relation to different institutions and customs. The old avant-gardistic willpower, the contemporary shaming curator, and finally and mainly the awkward intermediary period in the 80s in Germany, Austria, a little bit also Switzerland, the Netherlands, and other countries, when the curator did not really exist but was already needed by a new art world or a new art market. Let me start on a personal note. This is how to explain why group shows, what they mean to me in my youth or in my formative years, how I made experience with group shows. At that time, they were not shows. What I'm referring to are not shows, but records. I'm talking about compilation albums. Compilation albums that were producing a new musical phenomenon by collecting people from a certain style for the first time. They were either curated by a label, an independent label often, or a producer, sometimes a musician's cooperative. Records like No New York, curated by Brian Eno, which was the first record where you have people like Arthur Lindsay on and James Chance. Tooth and Nail, the LA Punk Compilation, maybe the compilation record, the group show that invented West Coast hardcore punk. Mutant Disco, a subtle discolation of the norm by Z Records, which was maybe the invention of something like decadent dance floor nightlife music in 1983, I guess. Or Business Unusual, the first meeting of punk and industrial. They were all announcing a majestic and or a massive novelty by saying there are more than one example of this novelty, of this entirely new phenomenon. They stressed the amazing singularity of the new by already putting it together with like-minded or similar phenomena into a category and a label. They produced paradoxically euphoria about the ultimately different by combining it with its kind. This is also the nucleus of the glory and misery of the group exhibition in the art world. The concept of a group show generates a syntactical problem. And I will look at different forms to solve or to complicate this problem. Different from the classical constellation with only two elements, like an artwork that is related to a producer, or an expression that is related to an artist. Here more elements come into play. The regular artwork which we attribute to an artist or an abstraction of an artist, like a prehistoric cave dweller or a tribe or a culture or the master of the so-and-so altar, is now at the same time attributed to a commonality of more artists, and in some cases an external reason for the commonality, politics, historical rupture, and finally in our age also to a new person, the curator. Thus we arrive at a multiple formula of knowns and unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld would say, which alter the way we receive art and initiate discourse about it. The syntax has become more complex, and with this increasing complexity also questions of hierarchies become more obvious, which are always important when a group or a public delegates the task to decide what is historical to one single representative. It follows immediately that there is either a rational explanation for the delegation, like the notion of the representative or the Soviet, or a quasi-religious magic, the curator's charisma, for example. A few days ago I was in Portugal looking at a group show which was called 12 Contemporaries. I was surprised that this kind of empty, or one could also say purist, title of a group show, which was popular in modernist times, would reappear at an ambitious museum of contemporary art today. But a crucial component of this formula seems to be that a certain, paradoxically speaking, specific emptiness seems to have been successful in enlarging the playing field for the artistic assertions and positioning. While meditating about this formula, large artistic effect generated by a strategically minimal description in the exhibition title, I learned that for the local audience in Portugal, the title was all but empty, but was a precise quote of a well-known and very influential group show at the same place from the early 90s that was called 10 Contemporaries, which started, among other things, the careers of Pedro Cabrita and other now famous Portuguese artists. So it seems to mimetically imitate the gesture of the empty title, while at the same time being the opposite of empty, by precisely signifying one historical exhibition, even close to a reenactment. A reenactment would be the opposite of 10 Contemporaries. Which introduces the following. The syntax of an exhibition title and the syntax of a principle of a group show work with subtext and allusions just like any other text, even if they are as short as 2 words. So it's not enough to consider the syntax and to deduct the problems of the exhibition act from the constituents of a sentence, as in the syntax. You also need to keep in mind that there are also allusions and other postmodern insecurities at work. But let's switch from syntax anyway to the argument of a group show and its title, which is the main strategic argument on the most basic level which all agents and agencies refer to, be it bureaucratic art administration, be it curators and their agenda, critics and their theories, dealers and their profit, or artists and their aesthetic or other goals. What they have in common is commonality itself as an argument. If you can demonstrate that the artistic singularity is not a singularity, you have a historic fact. You have to rewrite history or open a new chapter. The most important ideological component of the Western idea of art since Enlightenment, the singularity of the artist, his or her individuality as an important fact, can only be proven by proving the opposite. He or she is one of many, or 1 out of 12, or 1 out of 10. This is the paradoxical burden of the group show as a marker of history, of the historical. And this is even true when we do not talk about shows which refer to artists in their title and strategy, but to current affairs, philosophical subject matter, or political urgencies. These themes of theme shows become legitimated by proving that diverse artists are referring to them. If only one artist would do that, it would not be a proper theme. The personality would always be received stronger than what the subject matter is. It would be understood as expression. But when 10 people are expressing interest in the same subject matter, it's no longer 10 times expression, it's a phenomenon, it's a commonality, it's a tendency, it's a historical fact. I will look a little bit at group shows from a historical perspective and then return to these formal and syntactical questions of how to articulate a title, a relation to artists and subject matters in such a way that one achieves a certain assertion, an effect of history making, even a kind of magic, by enforcing upon the contemporary that we are experiencing something historic in the here and now. And I assume that is what every group show tries to achieve, while at the same time one might ask if this goal is appropriate, or should we finally start criticizing it and give up this goal and replace it with something else? Of course, the most important and most widely discussed agents that I have been talking about were curators in the new sense, often independent of specific institutions, known for certain individual qualities rather than specific traditional skills or expertise. They have changed a lot and even fundamentally altered the syntax of group show titles because they are now part of the full formula. I'll come back to this. But I'm most interested in were these strange group shows which we had in Germany in the 80s and which were a combination of the argument of contemporaneity with already some early appearances of the contemporary curator. But let's do a little chronology. Before there were curators, collective shows and group exhibitions were about new forms of art, not so much about any specific content or rarely an external subject matter on some theme in the world. Of course, these assertions about new forms, media, formats and strategies implied certain ideas about the world. They were not formalist, or only in a few cases. But they were drawing the discourse of legitimation not from a diagnostic or philosophical knowledge about the world, but from an expertise about art making. They were claiming, so to speak, what we, the undersigned of this group exhibition, claim is a knowledge about the world based on our knowledge on art making. And this is now. So, this was a very vaguely described period, what I'm talking about. When exactly was this heroic or archaic period of self-curated artist group shows? Did it really ever happen? Or is it some kind of magic vanishing point, projection we need in order to be able to deal with contemporary and historic forms of curating as different? Was there ever such a thing as a self-curating, or are we assuming that in the period before every fight and dine town started a biennial, and before journalistic, diagnostic exhibitions about contemporary subject matter started to spread, that there was a period in which group shows were not curated by people, but by history itself? A time when large historical mega-subjects, who were proudly bearing names like surrealism or socialist realism or high modernism or minimalism, were curating shows to which they would invite their humble citizens, the ones who would voluntarily populate their empires, so-called artists. Of course not. There were always specific people who initiated, decided, started, but they were less visible. And their lower visibility was part of their power to act under the disguise of history itself. So with the visible curator, the umbrella of history is less easily available. When you are doing a strategic group show, you are rather It will rather be attributed to your personality than to history. To simplify my point, I will distinguish 4 periods in the history of exhibiting contemporary art. First, the old way, the bureaucratic way. Certain artists were showing their work in a historical moment according to the rules of the local art business and organization. They took part in competitions, they were shown in the annual salon, following the Parisian model. Maybe they initiated even a salon des refusés, or they were even then represented by a dealer who was storing rather than exhibiting their work. But none of these constellations had any ambition in the curatorial sense, nor in the sense of representation of a specific art-related content. It was rather oriented towards the necessities of commerce, comparison and competition on one hand, or those of representation, ideology and education on the other. It was closer to the Academy Awards, which you also would not say, who curated the Academy Awards this year? Well, the Academy. There's not Massimiliano Gioni curating any. This would be interesting if the Academy Awards would be curated, but they are not. And this is the way it was in the art world a long time ago. Those artists who were present at a given time at a given Parisian salon had not necessarily anything in common. They were led into this room together exclusively because of several contingent circumstances. They were nominated, they were shortlisted. At least that is what we think and what the contemporary audience were supposed to think. In reality, in those salons, there was far more coherence and commonality than in most art shows we see today, roughly 150 years later. This is the case, of course, only because the number of acceptable practices at a given time was small and the spectrum narrower. To combine different contemporary artists did not require much more than such a bureaucratic procedure. Taste and distinction was rather reserved for those who, like private collectors, were mixing and combining art because they had art from different periods, or even different schools, parts of the world, and so on. Contemporaneity meant conformity. History meant diversity, a relation that has since been inverted, in a way. So group shows of this kind were an expression of consensus, and thus, dialectically, also an ideal background to express dissensus. But the only way to do that was outside of it, for example, with someone like Courbet founding his pavilion of realism, against the otherwise uniform manifestation of consensus. It was a relatively simple procedure of dissidence and exodus, a clearly defined establishment with analog aesthetic and institutional rules which you could get rid of effectively by negating both, in a classical Oedipal maneuver. But this attitude also gave birth to the possibility, roughly 20-30 years later, of a new formula, so to speak, a second stage. The dissenters in the age of the avant-gardes, roughly speaking, though still slightly Oedipal, was no longer based on the negation of a given uniformity. It was now also grounded on positive assertions, like, for instance, some understanding of realism, or the opposite. You are no longer simply a refusé in Paris or a secessionist in Vienna. Your practice is not the exodus, but you have a practice which is meaningful by itself, by a knowledge of one's own. You are a socialist, or you believe in psychoanalysis. This second period is the period of manifestos and avant-garde rhetoric. The discourse of legitimation were no longer based on a bipolar world of consensus and dissensus, academicism and useful rebellion, but on a plural competition of position. The group show was now needed to prove the reality of the practice you were referring to. It was no longer enough just to disagree as an artist. Your disagreement was also the source of a new agreement. The fight within the group of the agreeing group of secessionists or avant-gardists, as became notorious with the surrealists, was as serious as the fight with the outside. The leaders, like Breton or Guy Debord, had to stabilize the party line internally to be able to effectively fight whatever was defined as the outside of that inside. After this stage, the third, the post-heroic formula was generated, I would say roughly after the Second World War, which just stated that someone was from a certain country or would do a certain practice or be from a certain age, 10 contemporaries. This was a syntactical model of modernist purism, mainly in use after the Second World War. The only difference is that sometimes these formulas become meaningful, sometimes they are just an excuse for a group show that had no good reason, but still might be very meaningful internally. Had no good external reason, but might be meaningful internally. What I'm trying to say is that 10 Polish painters can mean literally something because at a given moment no one knows or no one realizes that there are 10 meaningful, relevant contemporary painters in Poland. Or 10 Polish painters can be just a lame excuse because one had no other idea for a title or wanted to reject communication with the outside world or wanted to communicate that there are no external, no extra artistic reasons for this show because of purism. I'll come back to this later. There is some general agreement that in the year 1972 contemporary curating had been invented by Harald Seemann. Or maybe even earlier, when he did, when Attitude Becomes Form, which was reconstructed last year at the Venice Biennial. But curated shows in this sense were clearly an exception and mainly reserved for few institutions like the Kunsthalle Bern, who would time and time again do things like that. In the 1970s there were only very few institutions like the Documenta or the Whitney or the Venice Biennial who could use such a curatorial approach because their size was so large that it was not possible to distinguish the exhibitions just by the type of art or the names of artists. And their ambition was so general and global that they could not just proclaim one certain type of art. So in the early days, what I call contemporary curating existed as an exception within a daily life in which group shows were still, in most cases, either legitimized factually, 10 rural area painters from the 50s, or manifesto-like, be it politically, 10 painters against the Vietnam War, or 10 female painters, or artistically, 10 abstract expressionists. But a problem arose. The three components of group shows between 1850 and 1950, roughly speaking, commonality, dissensus and novelty, proposal and achievement, were after a certain period no longer strong enough to establish or even claim historical breaks in a convincing way. And we remember that my thesis was that is the main idea of group shows, to claim historical relevance. This was not only the case because they had all been used, the three models, in an inflationary way, it was even worse that they had been used out of historical context. Commonality could only become meaningful in the classical paradoxical statement that your highly unusual specialty or singularity as an artist had to be considered historically important because it was not single and singular, but multiplying. Later it became necessary to accentuate your novelty and your disagreement with the refused. Then in the next stage it had to have a content like surrealism that had to be proposed. But after the war all three gestures were used simultaneously and in an increasing number, so a new element in the formula was needed, the independent curator. He or she was another singularity, not just a nameless expert who would do his or her job, but someone special that used a certain handwriting which one could recognize, some physiognomic specificity that you could recognize on magazine covers. This leads to my favorite historical area of curating, favorite not in the sense of really good shows or ideal, but in the sense of awkward and interesting. The pre-professional 80s, with their immensely growing and globally growing art market, and the desperate need for new ways to celebrate and articulate newness and novelty. But on the other hand, there were still not very many institutions. Most Western European art institutions of contemporary art outside of a few metropolises were planned and opened not earlier than during the mid-80s and early 90s. Eastern European and Mediterranean European institutions followed during the 90s. And the global inflation of biennials was a phenomenon of the last decade. Before these new institutions were successfully introduced and had started working, some intermediary solutions were necessary for a growing art market, which at the same time was suffering from a lack of signifiers of newness and relevance in relation to group exhibitions. There was money circulating, prepared to invest in artistic novelty, but there were no institutional or charismatic forces that were prepared to channel the money and tell the investors where to go. there was no language for the bank clerk, for the gallerist. I have to apologize that most of my observations from this pre-curatorial age are based on German, mainly German, Swiss, some Austrian and Dutch developments. Those were the ones I witnessed most closely, and they were also the most awkward ones, I think. One typical phenomenon of this period were sort of improvised extra documentas or side documentas or additional documentas. Mega events staged outside of city centers in fairgrounds with huge art historical, intellectual but also market ambition. In places where one would not do art shows anymore these days, but maybe an art fair, but nothing else. The mother of these battles was Caspar Koenig's show Westkunst in Cologne 1981, curated together with the critic Laszlo Gloser, but mostly attributed exclusively to Koenig. It combined three ideas. First, by calling what was so far considered to be modern art Westkunst, it relativized and celebrated this history. It relativized and celebrated this history by the same gesture. It combined the criticism of universalism, which was about to become a key feature of the 80s. This is not art per se, this is only its Western version, with a celebration of the now de-universalized West. Well, it's only the West, but look what the West achieved. At the same time, the word West did mean something else in 1981. It meant the NATO West and excluded Eastern Europe. This was another important act, since in the perspective of the period, there was no such a thing as a Western history of the avant-garde, without the Soviet, but also, of course, Czech and Polish avant-garde. So Koenig also claimed a different genealogy of the present, the contemporary of 1981, by constructing a rather American modernist continuity versus a pan-European avant-garde. The show started in 1939, so it included the war, but already claimed it's somehow contradictory as the beginning of the Cold War. This was clever, a bit dubious, but also very effective. The second idea was to leave out the 70s from his look back at the 20th century. The show ended in 1968, and so this was another prophetic gesture that we know since then. Never look at the recent past is a rule that many people use. The present and the past are both valuable and attractive, but not the very recent past. Also, Koenig played in 1981 with the anti-hippie spirit of the punk generation, and this went well with a young audience. And then certainly he included very young artists. He left out the 70s, but he had an extra show, an extra section of Westkunst that was called Today, Heute, with artists who just had their first show, but were obviously already a force on the market, like Julian Schnabel. So in one show with one gesture, he satisfied an anti-Eurocentric critical position, a conservative traditional pro-European position, and the young generation. And he replaced the heroism of the avant-gardes, of the pan-European avant-gardes, with the heroism or high modernism, which in this show was based on the war experience. And that is still very important for contemporary curators today, to satisfy disagreeing, heterogeneous audiences with one show. So the show was a huge success and had a lot of influence on the exploding art market of the 80s and its ideologies. And there were many successors with less witty shows, like Joachimidis with Zeitgeist in Berlin, or Gachnan with Bilderstreit in Cologne. Both, like several others, not exhibited in regular art institutions, but again in industrial fair architecture or irregular art spaces like the Martin Gropius Bau. It helped not so much directly to launch the curator boom, but the museum building boom. These shows were somehow saying, we seem to have no places for this. We have to go to these fairgrounds to do that. So obviously there's some new architecture needed, and there's the cities are called to pay for this. Yeah, but the museum building boom became a significant tendency in the 80s when all the then still rich middle-sized cities like Frankfurt, Stuttgart, Cologne, Düsseldorf, also some in Britain and the Netherlands, all had to build quickly new museums in a gesture that was a mix of social democratic cultural politics with the slogan "Culture for Everyone" and already investment in a growing art market as a factor of city marketing, art as a lifestyle. The simultaneity of these two politics, which still could be harmonized at that time, is maybe the dark mystery of group and theme-based shows. The social democratic slogan "Culture for Everyone", with its anti-elitist components, educational components, and the city marketing idea of commercializing and financializing bohemian lifestyle as an offer for the rich and the mobile, could still be understood as not antagonistic, because the museum, which was to be built to host these huge group shows, staged in the 20th century, this idea of the new contemporary museum was still a very well working cover and protection for the major contradiction of this type of cultural politics. And it functioned for a very long time. The idea that investment in such kind of things would mainly be part of an educational agenda, and at the same time the idea that this would be mainly something to improve the quality, the cultural quality of the city in order to be able to rise real estate prices and to advertise rich people to come into town and invest in the city. These two programs existed for a long time simultaneously within one city government. At the same time, a young avant-garde acted itself into history by curating themselves into spectacular group shows, which all had the aura of the new, the aggressive, the punk-like. Elend, that means misery, 1978 in Berlin. Aktion Pisskrücke, roughly translated Action Piss Crotch, 1979 in Hamburg. Finger für Deutschland, Finger for Germany, 1980 in Düsseldorf, which was this kind of finger for Germany, because it opened on the day of the general elections. Several other shows proclaiming newness and novelty in Stuttgart, Paris, Berlin, often connected with new painting, but as often not, but always connected to punk rock and aggressive anti-conceptual acts of immediacy, of insult and intensity popped up everywhere. 3 years later, in 1984, König did it again. He organized a second show, again in a fair architecture, this time in Düsseldorf, the old rival city of Cologne. This time it was supposed to be a show of German contemporary art. Although many artists were included that could not be called German in any sense, like Robert Fillou, Georges Brecht, Marina Abramovic, but who were all very important in Germany, or had worked there a lot. There were also, in this show of contemporary artists, several artists involved who were no longer alive, like Eva Hesse, another strange to call her German, or Marcel Botas, and again, many very recent artists whose career had just begun and who just had curated themselves into history through these 3 shows that I mentioned. Like Werner Büttner, Albert Oehlen, Martin Kippenberger. The title Von hier aus, literally starting from here, seemed to suggest a different sense of location and place, against the traditional identification of nationality or language or region with a certain form of art or another commonality. It used and problematized the attribute German in a similar way the previous show by König had problematized, but at the same time saved, the notion of modernity and Westernness. It was again kind of relativizing, liberalizing, questioning Germanness, the way Westmans had questioned Westernness, but then celebrated it. He was opening with an extremely extended idea of Germanness, which avoided all accusations of nationalism and essentialism, and at the same time allowed him to let survive the notion of cultural space and place as a commonality for a group show, which is not only important in those days for the cultural politics of the local and the regional, the typical European Union project of strengthening regions, but of course also for the competition of European cities for becoming the capital of the art market. One can say that Cologne successfully gained this position, which Paris had owned for a long time in the 80s, before losing it first to London and then to Berlin. Koenig's strategies operated successfully in satisfying the needs of cultural policy as well as the needs of this battle. But he was no partisan in this battle with a specific loyalty. He was for a long time connected with Cologne, then became the director of the important Art Academy in Düsseldorf, later moved to Frankfurt, became director of that Art Academy, and then returned to Cologne as director of the Museum Ludwig. In all these incarnations he was important for the city, but at the same time a well-known representative of certain ideas of art. The special connection of the notion of locality and other specific commonalities, which become the foundation of group shows and their logic, became a part of his public persona. And he was not the only one in that transitory period of pre-curatorial curating and representing. People between market events, art fairs and state institutions, between art schools and museums, began to unify the different functions in art politics in their persona. There were plenty of new type art celebrities in the 80s who came from that zone between fixed functions, who were able to take over different functions and thus unify them, not categorically, but by using their public persona as an interface of this mixed bag of functions. I mean, Koenig, even to a degree, was also an art dealer. I mean, not really an art dealer, but he was representing a certain group of artists who had no gallery. So even that was also one of his functions. But I already mentioned that curating in the new sense had been invented in Switzerland, and there were also a lot of, there were a few contemporaries of Seemann who had continued to work in this way, like Jean-Christophe Armand, Johannes Gartner and others from the museums in Basel and Bern. They took over functions in museum and academy and even publishing in other cities and countries. It was also a young Swiss enthusiast who was discovered by Caspar Koenig in the late 80s, early 90s, who became the poster boy for the new and contemporary curatorialism, Hans Ulrich Obrist, clearly some kind of son or successor who functioned as an interface to the increasingly unclear mix of tasks and functions between curating, marketing and criticism. But in the mid-90s, early zeros, the new curatorialism had taken over as a co-extensive phenomenon with the new biennialism, and thus created the situation we are still in right now. The formula of the group exhibition, the syntactical unit, involves now more parameters: the curator and his or her personality, the interest of marketing by cities and regions, but this is not necessarily mirrored in the number of components we find in the contemporary titles or in the communicative devices of art shows. The curator name and the local designation of the biennial are not problematized, but they function as some form of nature which covers the true functions in implementing group shows in the language of contemporary art production. In that sense, I would speak here for a clear description and separation of functions, which is somehow the key element of all qualified public spheres. The separation of powers as a foundation of democratic life also has some meaning in the syntax of art formats like group shows. The constituents of the syntactic unit should be visible and distinct. This is important for two reasons at least: as a measure against corruption and commercialism on one hand, but on the other in the interest of legibility, or if desired its opposite, of the show. Only if you separate and clearly distinguish the components, the constituents of a syntactical unit of a sentence, we are able to really read the sentence. Otherwise it becomes a scream or an exclamation mark. But before we can talk about this pledge for a new clarity in curatorial assertions, it is necessary to remember why it was attractive to mix these functions in the first place, since there were not only ideological reasons, but also good reasons for that kind of opening of the borders between the functions. The relative stability of the classic constituents of the group exhibition paradigm, local or cultural commonality, novelty or historic relevance, artistic commonality, were all based on an always already finished assumption of the function of art. Especially in the 90s, this was generally and globally challenged. One symptom of this shift, independently of the introduction of the new curator, was a tendency towards theme-based exhibitions. This was especially true in relation to activist art. For example, after and in relation to the AIDS crisis, feminist art, anti-racist art projects, but also such exhibitions which were referring to a certain historical forerunner, or in general to a historical framing. The reorientation in many art centers away from a subject-based, author-based notion of art gave group shows a new meaning, but it also opened a new independent sector of art producing, sometimes called project-oriented art. In shows like When Techno Turns to the Sound of Poetry in Zurich, or Oh Boy, It's a Girl in Munich, or Miners 96 in Düsseldorf, and many more in Copenhagen, often in the Schetthalle in Zurich, in the Netherlands. Often the names of the artists were not even mentioned. In When Techno Turns to Poetry, to the Sound of Poetry, no artists were mentioned, but all were female. But they were not. They had no. They were not. There were no signs saying which is what is made by whom. So the difference between curators and artists was no longer upheld, and the presentation of artwork often resembled the presentation of information, with lots of flip charts, mobile display elements, and so on. De-oratorization, anonymity of the producers, collective production were all seen as progressive elements of a post-subjectivist art production. Division of labor in the field of art was considered reactionary, and the term cultural producer started to replace artist. So here we arrive at an often overlooked but interesting point. We are against division of labor, but we are for the separation of powers. I don't know if we all agree about this, but there are some strong arguments for both, to be against the division of labor and to be for the separation of powers. Are we able to distinguish which of the two is at work in the behind-the-scenes situation of a group show production, in the syntax of the show? Precisely these tendencies to get rid of a division of labor also helped to introduce the culture of biennials and curators and provide them with legitimacy and notions of necessity. The dissolution of the division of labor was simultaneously pursued by the critics and the reformers of the contemporary art market from a different perspective, but successfully achieving their goal. Contemporary group shows have a problem with legibility because you never know who is speaking, or better, who is the subject of the sentence. A curator as a representative of a certain segment of the art world, or as an external expert, or as a hired hand in the name of tourism and city marketing, or as an idiosyncratic and very specific subject, just like an artist. This is not just a problem. The ambition of art itself, from the neo-avant-garde of the 60s to the activism of the 90s, has been to be more than just a segment, a department of cultural life. It is only logical that a curator can no longer be just a person with some art historical expertise. The curator has to be an expert of the world. Well, then the question remains, why do we have to have curators as distinct entities at all? Why not expanding the role of the artist into curating? And of course, this is also not new. Not only in the era of manifestos and ruptures, but also recently, self-curating or artist-based curating could be observed as a tendency, a sub-theme of the general dissolution of clearly defined and divided cultural labor, or as a gesture of empowerment and magic. In the 80s, parallel to the early proto-curators like König and Gartner, we have seen that artists like the group around Kittmacher and Albert Oehlen curated themselves in the three shows I mentioned. Groups of the then new painters in several other countries restarted the ever-popular idea that whenever you could launch a certain new commonality effectively, you would no longer need the official approval by critics and curators, you could do it yourself. But the main difference to the heroic avant-gardists, the days of the manifesto-led group shows, was in the 80s the absence of exactly that, manifestos. There were none, or at least no serious manifestos. If there were any, they were ironical. The shift which happened then moved the legitimizing function of the manifesto to the performative quality of the group in question. It had to be more than just a number of artists, but they had to become a recognizable collective. Recognizable because of their features as a group, also beyond one specific show, rather than because of any specific content of their art. This contributed to the phenomenon that self-curated or friend-curated groups became identical with the stable of artists of a specific gallery. Many galleries show groups of artists that previously were collectively shown in institutional group shows. The increasing emptiness of the organized commonality could be filled with anything. A meaning, a thesis, but obviously also just a gallery connection. But obviously just a gallery connection, a contract. This mechanism even still resonated a decade later in the now repoliticized and critical art shows of the 90s. Here the empty signifier of pure quality or performative strength or only the best from the 80s boy group shows was often replaced with an often similarly empty or underqualified notion of radicality or criticality, without describing critical of what or radical in relation to what. But typically for post-Fordist developments, the turn of the intention of production upon the self and the inner life, the discovery and subsequently colonization of the inner self of the group or the curator produced not only stress and rituals of exclusion in the groups and neurosis and self-marketing on the side of the curator, it also became quite predictable because finally the multitude of singularities in the group, or the many formally divided types of labor and interest and expertise who melted into the personality of the curator, lost all their distinctiveness in the process in which they were finally all covered by the blanket or the interface of the elite or the self. And this is why I want to close this talk by directing our attention to two, in my mind, crucial conditions for the group show, which may sound very banal. On one hand, they should be as complex as possible, and on the other hand, they should be as legible as possible. In order to be complex, they should not necessarily contain as much art or as many elements or as many artists as possible, or any quantifiable components, but as many distinct components. Components that are not only distinct as different objects, but exist on different planes or levels. A syntax, so to speak, with paratactical and hypotactical clauses. A syntax that is not just sentence, 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 but sentence and subclause, not clause and subclause. A curator and a subcurator, an artist, and then finally hierarchies which subvert the hierarchies. A director of a Kunstverein who hires an artist to curate a show with work which the members of the Kunstverein have collected, and then confronts these works with other works by the same artist but from public collections, which additionally are somehow antagonistic to the privately collected ones, for example. And this was just a fictitious example using elements of an old Andrea Fraser project. But in order to be legible, the formula, the idea of a group exhibition, needs to work with at least one or two conventional uses of components, like commonality, or the artist, or intervention, or novelty. These two imperatives seem to contradict each other, and many complex exhibition paradigms generate mushy, dominant interfaces, like persons or groups, or an interface category like the curator, as a cover for different functions within a complex construction. For that reason, it is necessary to confront the complexity with legibility as an antagonist. It is similar to ideas of self-reflexivity and self-framing, but not reduced to reflexivity as the only possible second level. There are several possible complications if only they are presented in a legible way without covers. A situation in which one side is accusing the other permanently as being too simple or not readable can be quite productive, but of course also nerve-wracking. But it is readable, but it is the readable other of magic and charisma politics. A second option beyond the grammar of the show is to situate the productive tension of the group show in a relation between the idea of the show and an idea about art or new observation, and the work it shows outside simple illustration, as is the case in so many theme-based shows. Instead, the idea of the show and the art in the show would be presented as two intellectual enterprises of different kinds, but arriving at similar or the same conclusion. Douglas Crimm's famous show Pictures from 1977 has been a historical case in point. Artists like Cindy Sherman or Jack Goldstein were working about cultural industrial or mass cultural picture production in the same way that Grimm was arguing against the modernist dogma of media specificity, where a painting had to be a painting, not a picture. He was arguing for the discussion of pictures in the same way the artists were doing it. Although, of course, using completely different elements in the argument and existing on different levels. A recent contemporary example, something like Susanne Pfeffer's show Speculation on Anonymous Material in Kassel, with so-called post-internet art. She tries to prove, and I don't know if successfully because I have not seen it but read a lot about it, how artistic thinking and research arrived at similar idea like as the new theoretical trend or fashion of speculative realism in philosophy. And then she invites the philosophers to have a symposium in the show. In both examples, we are confronted with a different negation of division of labor, not by covering diverse and different functions with the interface of the charismatic curator, but by accepting both curator-critic and artist both as some kind of researcher, theoretician, or truth seeker. This is a strategy I've seen quite often recently. Its solution of the separation of power versus division of labor situation is often mushy, but there's at least consciousness about it. One last point. What is Kaspar König doing right now? He is curating the next manifesta in St. Petersburg in Russia. A week ago he released a statement why manifesta is going on as planned, not intending to boycott Russia because of the annexion of the Crimea. Instead, they are going to monitor events in Ukraine precisely and see what's going on. Another problem, of course, of curating will in all probability not be the general problem of group shows, but how to prevent biennials and manifestas from becoming something like the FIFA or the IOC. Thank you for your attention.
That was unexpected.
It was just a...
Proszę Państwa, jeżeli są pytania, można również zadawać w języku polskim. Asking for questions.
Of course, yeah. You could guess from the situation.
I would have a thing that I've observed that you started with a...
I've observed that you started with religious rhetorics, and isn't the era of manifestos and high modernism, and then for the times when this religious discourse could be exchanged for a more secular party, for political discourse, for example, groupings. And fighting against. Isn't that my just?
No, I think that the formal problem of the religious still exists, since the difference between historical event and the singularity, the appearance of a singularity is the distinction between what happens in the social, historical, political continuum and that what cannot be explained. And that what cannot be explained comes from the domain of the religious. But of course, and that is how artists were even then still described, even then when they were part of political groups. As artists, the logic was still that they were kind of messiahs, but once they joined the Situation International, they were of course party soldiers. But the fascinating thing was that there was an army of party soldiers who all were little Jesuses. So that was this construction is the is what makes it interesting, no? The idea of the group show. But the manifesto era or the avant-garde era is the one in which they started to rationalize why they were together. So that was of course an act against the religious component. They were trying to rationalize that they were sharing certain ideas and certain reasons, and that was of course rationalizing also the function of the artist, even in these classical confrontations between Surrealists and the French Communist Party. So that's true, yeah.
Żadnych obserwacji, pytań, spostrzeżeń?
I will use this opportunity to ask one more
sure.
question about your final remark about Manifesta. I mean, it seems like for Kasper Kunisch, nothing changed in a way. I mean, he's just more conscious of the fact that this is the big biennial events are the force of the capital than he was in the 80s. Isn't this? And that's what makes his statement hypocritical.
I don't know. I mean, it's really difficult, because what was so interesting about him was how he solved the cultural political problems of the two sides, but of course the two sides of the political center, the center left and center right, but they had different cultural politics, and he translated that into consolation, into exhibition models that offered a consolation of these two. In a time when none of them were really articulated. Both programs, the Culture for Everyone social democratic program was already articulated, but the Richard Florida side wasn't even articulated, but somehow already started to begin to exist. And there was also the third factor, the young people, the young wild ones, the punk rock generation, and so on, that he also kind of satisfied. And of course he's an interesting curator. He really knows a lot about a lot of interesting art, and knows a lot of people, and somehow knows how to give weight to his strategic interventions. But like I said, he's not the interesting thing is that he was not a partisan of any specific city or any specific art form, but he was always like it became more and more a model. And of course, Manifesta, without him, is a model too. And it waited much later, but as we've all seen, it can be. There were some manifestos that somehow, in a way, in an interesting way, were relating to some local situation. Sometimes it was just really an empty formula of the adoption of local situations, and there was even one which completely failed for political reasons because there was a conflict, and this always had a lot to do with the fact that those curators who were involved in it didn't really know how much they were like non-partisan curators that could be adopted to certain situations, or how they were. Maybe they were partisan in a way, or they would follow some other partisans. That is really and now with this situation, I mean, if I would have gotten to it, I wouldn't know what to do in his case. I mean, it's of course a very empty and sentence to say we monitor what's going to happen, and I think it's somehow the idea of the ever expanding art market here comes to an interesting halt. It is obviously not possible at a place where expansion is already no longer just thought of in monetary terms, but where you already have you already need the critical content, the social content of manifestas in order to legitimize the expansion of the art market, that this all collapses. And I mean, I don't know if I would call the statement hypocritical. I would say it's really there's really a problem. He's really in. I don't envy him. Yeah.
You referred often to the concept of syntax, and I would like to ask you if you put this syntax within a larger grammar, and if so, how would you describe this grammar of culture, capital, or social, cultural politics? And you also mentioned many times the notion of emptiness, and would you connect this emptiness effect with the operation of these grammar structures, or with what, actually?
Yeah, I think I have several stages. The first stage is to look at the syntax as the placeholder of modernism, as the idea that a sentence can be just uttered, and then it has a content, and that's the sentence, and it is not related to any. It is not involved in or not shaped or problematized by who's uttering it where and under which circumstances. And then there's a second stage where I mentioned this Portuguese show, the fact that you can do grammatically this and do something else at the same time. You don't follow that model. And then there's a third stage where I'm talking about the exhibition act, as of course there is it puts something into existence. It is not just an uttering, an observation that someone mumbles to himself or herself, but it's something that tries to speak something into existence. That was the title of the show, so, of the talk, to curate something into history. And so that is the. I think that is the context of this metaphor of this observation about that group exhibitions that cannot rely on an expressive or subjectivist model of artist speaks, have to come up with some kind of syntax, I think capital in a specific way does not come into the question whether this description is apt or not, because basically what capital comes into place when it's about the question whether the signs the syntax is composed of are relevant or not, and that were in my tale the construction of museums in the 80s. They were necessary because they gave the signifiers a meaning, and the group show logic or the group show syntax only organizes the signifiers, but the fact that the signifiers became serious or that they were attractive for capital was constructed on another level. The group show problem existed in a way like in a 90-degree angle to that. And finally, the question of emptiness is of course related to the notion of autonomy. It is the dialectics of autonomy, if you wish. The problem that the larger the autonomy in a certain construction, it is always in danger and fall into emptiness. But also of course it practically offers freedom. It gives opportunity.
if we don't have any more questions, then thank you very much, Diedrich, for
Thank you.
this wonderful talk.
Thank you.